Rowena felt the cold of the great hall's stone floor through the thin soles of her shoes the moment they stripped the circlet from her head. No warning, no whispered apology. Just the sharp click of metal leaving her hair and then the sound of the court, that low collective exhale that was almost worse than laughter. Alpha King Theron stood at the top of the dais. He did not look at her. He hadn't looked at her once since the ceremony began, and she understood in the way you understand something before you're ready to. That he had made his choice long before this moment. His hands were steady as he lifted the Luna crown, her crown, and settled it onto Calla's dark hair. Calla, who smiled like she'd been practicing this exact smile for months. Calla, who probably had. The bond twisted. That's the only word for it. She could feel it inside her chest, something that had always been warm, and tethered, suddenly wrenching sideways like a rope pulled past its limit. She pressed her hand flat against her ribs and said nothing. Around her the court watched. A few of them smirked. She recognized faces she had sat beside at formal dinners, faces that had nodded respectfully when she passed. Now they looked at her the way people look at something that used to matter. Calla descended the dais slowly, deliberately, the new crown catching the torchlight. She stopped in front of Rowena, reached out, and pressed a kitchen apron into her hands, folded neatly like an insult wrapped in politeness. "You'll be more useful below," Theron said from the dais. His voice was flat, practiced. He still didn't look at her. The court laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound filled the hall and bounced off the high stone arches, and Rowena stood there holding a kitchen apron while two guards materialized at her sides to escort her toward the servant stairs. She walked. She kept her chin level. She noticed because she had always been someone who noticed things that the passage they guided her through ran directly beneath the throne room. The stones here were older, darker, worn smooth by decades of feet that no one in the great hall above had ever bothered to count. She could hear the muffled sounds of the kitchens ahead, fire movement, the clatter of iron pots and something else, the low, constant hum of a place that never stopped working. They thought they were sending her somewhere lesser. She could feel even then, even in that first hollow minute of loss, that they were wrong. The kitchens fed the castle. The kitchens knew its schedules, its secrets, its hunger. Every corridor above depended on what happened in the rooms below, and no one above ever thought about that. They never do. Calla had the crown. Theron had made his choice in front of everyone in the loudest way possible, so there would be no question and no going back. But Rowena was walking straight into the heart of Blackthorn, and she had no idea yet just how much power was waiting there for someone willing to reach for it. The source of power, that's exactly where they sent her. The underground kitchens of Blackthorn smelled of tallow and old smoke. Stone walls wept with condensation. The floor was cold, not the cool of a morning corridor, but the deep, bone-settling cold of a place that never saw the sun. Rowena stood in the middle of it all on her first morning and said nothing. There was nothing to say. She tied back her hair, looked at the iron pot stacked in the corner, and got to work. She had never scrubbed a pot in her life. By noon, the skin between her fingers had gone raw. By evening, her palms were blistered, the soft skin peeling back in a way that made her breath catch every time she gripped the handle of a brush. She did not ask for salve. She did not ask for anything. She just kept working. Because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the look on Theron's face in the great hall, that flat, careful blankness, as though she were furniture. He had decided to move to another room. The cruelty from above came in waves, not dramatic, incremental. That was almost worse. A page would appear at the kitchen door holding a tray of dishes from the royal feast, wine glasses smeared with deep red gold-rimmed plates, still carrying the scent of meat and honeyed bread. Calla's doing. Everyone knew it. The page wouldn't say a word. He would just set the tray down and leave, and Rowena would clean them. Every one. Because refusing would give Calla exactly the reaction she was hunting for, and Rowena had decided somewhere in the ache of that first sleepless night that she would not be hunted easily. The dirty water came on the third day. A woman, one of Calla's personal attendants, the one with the sharp jaw and the flat eyes, walked through the kitchen carrying a bucket. She didn't slow down. She didn't announce herself. She just upended it directly over Rowena as she knelt beside the washing basin. Cold gray water. The smell of it was something Rowena refused to identify. It soaked through her dress into her hair down the back of her neck. She could feel every eye in the kitchen go still. She stood up slowly. She wrung out the hem of her dress. She picked up her brush and went back to work. It was the stillness in the room that surprised her. The other workers, a young girl who stoked the fire, two older women who managed the bread ovens, a man who hauled wood, they had all stopped breathing. They were watching her, not with contempt, with something closer to recognition. Theron came through that same afternoon. Not to the kitchens, he would never lower himself that far, but to the corridor just above, inspecting the lower passages with his steward. Rowena heard his footsteps before she saw him through the iron grate set high in the kitchen wall. She could feel the pull of the mate bond before she even looked up. It was involuntary, like flinching from heat. He saw her. She was sure of it. His eyes moved to the grate, and then after a long moment away, he kept walking. He said something to his steward about the drainage and turned the corner. She went back to the dishes. Her hands were shaking. She told herself it was from the cold water still drying in her hair. That night she heard him. The ventilation shafts in Blackthorn ran like veins through the castle's older stone connecting rooms that had no other relationship to each other. Sound traveled through them in odd, unpredictable ways. Rowena was sitting near the far wall, pressing a damp cloth to her blistered palms, when she heard Theron's voice, low, measured, unhurried. "The bond fades," he said. "Given enough time, enough distance, it always does." Calla's reply was softer, harder to catch. Something about patience, something about certainty. Rowena sat with that for a long time. A long, still, airless moment. She did not cry. She wanted to. The want of it sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. But she pressed the cloth harder against her palm and let the sting of it anchor her to the present. To the cold floor, to the kitchen that smelled of smoke and tallow, and something else now, something that felt, if she was honest, like the first edge of anger. It was Birch who found her like that. He was a stocky man with a broken nose that had healed slightly sideways, one of the older kitchen workers who seemed to belong to every shift, and none of them. He sat down beside her without asking permission, which she liked. He didn't offer sympathy either, which she liked even more. "You know what's funny," he said quietly, setting a small piece of bread beside her hand, "is that the king thinks the walls down here are silent." She looked at him. "They're not," he said. "The cooks hear the steward. The steward hears the guard captain. The guard captain drinks with the stable master." He picked up a rag and started cleaning without being asked. "Everything spoken in this castle eventually finds its way down here." She could feel something shift inside her. Not comfort, not hope exactly. Something more like orientation, the sensation of suddenly knowing which direction was north. Calla had the throne room. She had the crown, the feasts, the title, and the king's public loyalty. And she was welcome to all of it, because Rowena was starting to understand that the kitchens were not a punishment. They were a foundation, and she was only just beginning to build. But a listening post can be weaponized just as easily as it reveals secrets. Rowena learned that truth the hard way. 3 days after she'd begun noticing the pattern of whispered conversations, the way servants brought her news like offerings, Calla walked into the great hall draped in silk, the color of fresh cream. The Alpha King sat on his throne. Rowena was scrubbing the stone floor near the kitchens when the summons came, not a polite request, but a guard's hand on her arm, pulling her upright. She could feel the wrongness before she even understood it. That pull, that constant hum between her and Theron went rigid, sharp, like a nerve struck. They dragged her through the corridors in her stained kitchen apron, her hands still wet, and threw her before the throne. The great hall was packed, every eye turned toward her. Calla stood at the base of the dais, her face streaked with tears, her voice trembling, as though her heart was breaking. "She stole it from me," Calla's words dripped like poison. "My mother's ring. The one thing I had left of her. It's been in my family for generations, and she took it. I found her hiding it in the kitchen stores, and when I confronted her, she threatened me. She said if I told anyone, she'd make sure I never wore it again." Rowena's breath caught. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Calla was already pressing forward, already letting her voice crack with practiced pain. "She's dangerous. She pretends to be meek to be helpful, but she's been poisoning the household. The servants won't speak against her because she's charmed them somehow. She listens to everything. She knows everything. Don't you see? She's a threat to all of us." A long moment passed. Rowena stood there, her apron still damp, her hands trembling. And she looked at Theron. She looked at the Alpha King on his throne, and she waited for him to see through it, to feel through it, to know her the way a mate was supposed to know. The bond between them was screaming. She could feel it like a second heartbeat, like something alive and frantic inside her chest. Surely he could feel it too. Surely he would know that she would never. Theron's jaw tightened. His eyes met hers for a single breath, and then he looked away. "Bring the ring," he said. His voice was flat, controlled. One of Cala's attendants stepped forward, holding a small wooden box. Inside, wrapped in velvet, was a ring, silver set with a stone the color of midnight. Beautiful. Damning. Rowena had never seen it before in her life. "Where was it found?" Theron asked. "In the root cellar," Cala whispered. "Hidden behind the preserves. She thought no one would look there." The lie was perfect because it held just enough truth. Rowena did know the root cellar. She did know where things were hidden. And there was no way to prove she hadn't been there because she had been. Of course she had. She worked in the kitchens. Theron stood. The movement was slow, deliberate, and it made something inside Rowena crack. "Rowena," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded like a verdict. "Do you deny this?" She found her voice, but it came out broken. "I've never seen that ring before. I didn't take it. Cala is lying." Cala flinched as though struck. Her hand went to her throat. "She's lying now," Cala said softly. "She's so good at it." Theron descended the dais steps. He walked toward Rowena, and she could smell him. Wood smoke, and something wild, something that called to everything in her that was wolf. The bond between them was agonizing now, a physical thing, a rope pulled too tight. He should feel it. He should know. But his face was stone. "Lock her in the cold storage cellar," he said, "until she decides to tell the truth." The words hit like a blow. Rowena staggered backward. "Theron, no, please, you know me, I feel a thief in my home," he said, and his voice was so cold it made the air itself seem to freeze. "And I will not have it." He turned away from her. The guards moved in. They grabbed her arms, and she didn't fight them, because fighting would only prove Cala's lies. She let them drag her down into the belly of Blackthorn, down where the stone sweated cold, and the air tasted like iron and old earth. The cellar door slammed behind her. The bolt slid home, and the mate bond. God, the mate bond became something unbearable. It was like being torn in half while still alive, like her wolf was clawing at the inside of her skin, trying to reach him, trying to make him understand. She sank onto the cold stone floor and didn't let herself cry. Hours passed, maybe longer. Rowena sat in the dark, her apron still damp, her hands still shaking. She tried not to think about how easily he'd believed Cala, how quickly he'd chosen the lie over her, how the Alpha King had looked at her with something that wasn't even anger, just indifference, disappointment, as though she'd been a problem to solve and he'd solved it. That was when she heard the sound, a scraping, stone on stone, soft, deliberate. Birch, the old groundskeeper, was there. He'd come down with a lantern, moving carefully through the shadows. He didn't speak, just gestured for her to follow. Behind a stack of old crates, behind decades of dust and cobwebs, there was a gap in the stone wall. A passage. Hidden. Forgotten. The kind of thing that only someone who'd worked Blackthorn for 50 years would know about. "Go," Birch whispered. "Move through the tunnels. They run under the whole castle. You'll find your way out, or you'll find your way to answers. Maybe both." Rowena looked at the passage. She looked at this old man who had served the castle all his life, who had nothing to gain by helping her except that she'd once asked him about his daughter, had once listened when he needed to talk about his grief. The listening post had become a network, and the network had just given her something Cala had never expected. Access to the hidden heart of Blackthorn itself. The grain vaults lay 3 levels below the castle, proper, carved into bedrock so old it predated the keep itself. Rowena had never been down there, no reason to, until Birch found her in the servants' corridor one afternoon, his weathered face tight with something between fear and duty. He didn't greet her, just said, "You need to see what's under the vaults, not what's in them, what's underneath." She could feel the weight of his words before she understood them. A long moment passed between them, the kind where someone's already decided to betray a loyalty and there's no taking it back. "Why me?" she said. "Because you help people. And because the king doesn't." Birch glanced over his shoulder. The corridor was empty. "Cala's been down there twice this month, laughing, like she owns the place." He led her down stone stairs, worn smooth by centuries. Cold air rose from below, carrying the scent of grain dust and something else, something sour, like neglect. At the bottom he lit a lamp. The vault stretched out in both directions, wooden crates, stacked floor to ceiling. Winter stores. Enough to feed the pack through the snow. Except it wasn't. Birch moved to the far wall where a section of stone had been carefully carved away, and beyond it lay a narrow passage. He stooped and entered. Rowena followed her heartbeat loud in her ears. The passage opened into a small chamber. More stone, a single wooden table. And on that table, leather ledgers, their pages yellowed and dense with numbers. "Found them 3 days ago," Birch said quietly. "Been coming down here nights since, making sure I read them right." Rowena opened the first ledger. The handwriting was precise, methodical. Names of villages, quantities of grain, dates spanning the last 4 years. She read the entries once, then again slower. "He sold it," she whispered. "All of it, or near enough." Birch's voice was steady, but she could hear the anger underneath. "Winter before last, the borders needed reinforcement. War debts. He ordered it done in secret. No announcement, no official record in the Great Hall. Just sold the stores to merchants from the Eastern Territories. Paid off the debts in coin." Rowena turned pages. The transactions were meticulous. Quantities, prices, signatures of the merchants. And underneath, in a different hand. Calla's hand, she realized calculations. Luxury goods. Imported silks. Jeweled ornaments. Repairs to the throne room. "How long?" Rowena said. 4 years. The grain's been going out faster than it comes in. Every winter the shortage gets worse. The villages on the northern border, they're already rationing. Come January, February, they'll be hungry. Real hungry. She could feel something shifting inside her. Not anger exactly. Clarity. The kind that comes when you stop looking away from what you've been refusing to see. "Why didn't you tell the king?" Birch laughed once, sharp and bitter. "Tell him what?" "That he made a choice, he knows. He chose the war over the people, and he nodded upward toward the castle proper, toward Calla. She chose herself over both." Rowena closed the ledger. "Does anyone else know?" "Not about the ledgers, but the villages know. They see the shortages coming. The hunters are thinner this year. The stores aren't what they should be." He paused. "Some of them are already talking about leaving." The weight of it settled on her shoulders. Not just the betrayal, though, that was real, and it cut deeper than she wanted to admit about Theron, but the scale of it. The Alpha King had sworn to protect his people, to ensure they survived the winter, to keep the pack fed and whole. Instead, he'd emptied the stores to pay for a war that wasn't even his to fight, and his mistress had turned what remained into ornaments and luxury. "I'm not going to poison him," Rowena said quietly. Birch looked at her surprised. "I'm not going to burn the castle down either, or slit his throat in the dark." She opened another ledger. "But I'm going to know exactly what happened. Every transaction, every village affected, and I'm going to move what I can quietly to the people who need it." "That's treason." "No," she said. "That's keeping them alive. There's a difference." Birch nodded slowly. "I'll help. I know the merchants who buy from us. I can trace the chains, figure out where the grain went, if any of it can be recovered. And the villages." Rowena's mind was already moving, already calculating. "We need to know exactly who's in trouble, which families, which months. We work through the guards, through the stable hands, through anyone who travels to the border posts. We build a map. That's a lot of people to trust." "I know." She looked up at him. "But you just trusted me with treason. I can trust them with survival." The next 3 weeks became a careful architecture of whispered conversations and small movements. A bundle of grain diverted from the kitchen stores to the family of a guard whose sister lived in the northern villages. A quiet word to the stable master about which supply routes could carry extra weight. A conversation with the head cook who turned out to have relatives near the border who was more than willing to help stretch the castle's resources further. Rowena never touched poison, never raised her hand in violence, but she began to understand something about power that had nothing to do with a crown or a title. It came from knowing things, from being trusted, from moving carefully, methodically without demanding recognition or glory. The Alpha King had chosen war and luxury, but Rowena was choosing something else. She was choosing to keep her people alive, even if it meant doing it in the dark, even if Theron never knew her name. The ledger stayed hidden in the chamber beneath the vaults, and every day in small ways Rowena built a network that belonged entirely to her. The kingdom was starving, and Rowena knew exactly who was responsible. Not the Alpha King, though his absence had cost them, but the woman wearing his crown. Calla had always been cruel to servants, the kind of cruelty that came from boredom and entitlement. A maid brought the wrong shade of wine. Calla threw the goblet. A stable hand forgot to polish a saddle to her exacting standard. She had him whipped in the courtyard, made an example of him so no one would forget her reach. The guards looked away. The cook said nothing, but Rowena watched, and she remembered every name. 3 weeks into Calla's reign, the grain stores were nearly empty. Not because there was no harvest, the autumn crops had been decent enough. Calla had simply decided to hoard supplies in her personal chambers, convinced that scarcity would keep the staff desperate and obedient. She'd locked the storage houses and kept the keys herself, and the kitchens were running on scraps. Rowena walked past the cook's quarters one morning and found the head cook sitting on a stool, her face gray with exhaustion, her hands shaking as she tried to portion out what little remained. The woman didn't notice Rowena at first. She was too busy calculating how to stretch 10 loaves of bread across 50 mouths. Rowena knelt beside her. A long moment passed between them. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." The cook looked up, startled. She'd been in the castle longer than anyone except the Alpha King himself. She'd cooked for his mother. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. Instead, she talked. She told Rowena about the sealed storage houses, about the grain rotting because Calla had forgotten about it, about the kitchens that could feed half the castle if someone would just open those doors. Rowena listened, and she made a choice. She couldn't steal the keys, but she could do something else. That afternoon, she found a young guard, one of the ones who'd looked away during the whipping. His name was Marcus, and he was ashamed. She didn't say anything about that. Instead, she asked if he knew anyone in the stable who might be willing to help with a problem. He did. She asked the stable hand if he knew anyone in the lower gates. He did. She didn't explain what the problem was. She didn't have to. Everyone in Blackthorn was hungry. Everyone knew it wasn't necessary. Within 2 days, there was a loose board in the wall of the largest storage house. Within a week, grain was moving quietly through the castle in small amounts, enough to feed the staff properly, not enough to be obviously missed from Calla's careful count. Rowena didn't touch the grain herself. She simply knew where it was going. The cook knew. The stable hand knew. The guards knew, and slowly, carefully, they began to tell her other things. The gate sentries mentioned that the eastern roads were being patrolled by wolves that didn't belong to the Alpha King's pack. The kitchen maids whispered about travelers passing through who spoke of rebellion brewing in the outer territories. A groundskeeper mentioned that the well water was beginning to taste strange. Poison maybe, or just neglected because no one was maintaining the castle properly anymore. Rowena listened to everything. She didn't interrupt. She didn't judge. She simply heard them, and they felt the difference. She was in the Great Hall one evening when Calla stormed through, accusing the staff of theft. Her face was mottled with rage. She demanded the keys be changed. She demanded an investigation. She demanded that someone be punished. The guards stood silent. The servants kept their eyes down. And Rowena sat quietly in the shadows, watching the queen tear herself apart over a problem she didn't understand. The grain was fine. The hoarding continued, just smarter now. But Calla's paranoia was growing. She was making enemies faster than she could count them. Rowena told herself this was practical. She was solving problems. She was keeping people alive. She was protecting the castle from the inside, while the Alpha King was God knows where, doing God knows what. It was all logical. But at night, alone in her chamber, she thought about Theron. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in those final moments before he left. She thought about the bond that had pulled at her for so long, the wordless knowing that had made her feel less like a woman and more like a tool, a means to an end. And she realized something that made her stomach turn cold. She was still waiting for him. Even now, even as she built her quiet network of loyal people, even as information flowed to her from every corner of the castle, she was still waiting. Waiting for him to come back. Waiting for him to notice what she'd done. Waiting for him to choose her, to claim her, to make all of this mean something beyond survival. She stood at her window and looked out at the castle at Blackthorn, which was no longer just his kingdom. It was hers now, too, in ways that mattered. The kitchens answered to her. The gates whispered her name. The stables hummed with her presence. The workers trusted her more than they'd ever trust a crown that was being worn by a woman who saw them as nothing. Calla had the throne. But Rowena had something far more dangerous. She had the people, and she was finally beginning to understand what that meant. But Rowena didn't see it coming. Not really. She was too busy moving through the castle solving the problems no one else would touch. A guard's daughter needed medicine. The granaries were running low. Someone had to organize the winter stores, and Calla certainly wasn't going to do it. So Rowena kept her head down, kept working, and told herself that maybe, just maybe, the Alpha King would notice what she was building. The quiet loyalty. The way people trusted her now. The way information flowed to her from every corner of Blackthorn, whispered from the kitchens, the gates, the stables. She had become something. Not the woman at the throne, but the woman people went to when they needed the truth. Then the grain store burned. It happened in the dead of night. Rowena woke to the smell of smoke curling through her small chamber. By the time she reached the courtyard, half the winter stores were gone. Charred beams, scattered grain. The guards stood around it confused, looking to one another for answers. And standing at the edge of the smoke, her face twisted with something like triumph, was Calla. The Alpha King's mate was losing her grip on the castle, and she knew it. So she decided to burn it down rather than watch it slip away. But she'd also decided who would take the blame. Rowena realized at the moment the guards turned to her, the way their eyes shifted. Not suspicious exactly, uncertain, like they wanted to believe something else but couldn't quite manage it. Rowena was seen near the stores at dusk, one of the older guards said. His voice was careful. He didn't want to say it. She said nothing. What was there to say? She'd been there moving supplies, organizing the shelves. Of course she had. She was always there. And Calla had known it. By morning, Birch was arrested. Rowena's oldest ally in the castle, the man who'd stood beside her since the beginning, was dragged before the court with chains on his wrists. He'd been seen talking to Rowena the night before. That was all they needed. That was enough. The Alpha King sat on his throne, that high, cold seat that Rowena had stopped trying to reach, and he listened to the accusations without expression. Calla stood at his side, her hand resting on his arm, whispering things Rowena couldn't hear. The service keys were confiscated. Every key that granted access to the castle's inner workings, every door that Rowena had used to move freely to help to build her network, gone, locked away. And with them went her ability to move unseen, to solve problems quietly, to be useful. 2 days later, she was dragged before the great hall again. The court had assembled. The elders sat in their high chairs. The Alpha King was there. Calla was there. And Rowena stood in the center of it all, her wrists bound, her throat tight, wondering how many times she could stand in this same spot and survive it. "You burned the grain stores, sure," the Alpha King said. His voice was flat, almost bored. "To frame Calla, to make her look unstable, to turn the people against her." Rowena looked at him. A long moment stretched between them. She could feel the bond thrumming beneath her skin, that pull that had never quite gone away, no matter how many times she'd tried to kill it. It was screaming at her now, screaming that this was wrong, that he knew this was wrong. She opened her mouth. "I didn't burn anything." "Then you were negligent," Calla said, stepping forward. Her voice was smooth as silk. "You were responsible for those stores. Your failure cost us winter food. Children will go hungry because of your incompetence." Rowena's hands clenched. "You know what I did. You know I organized those stores. You know the people brought me their grain because they didn't trust you to keep it safe." The Alpha King said nothing. "If I confess," Rowena said slowly, "will you show mercy?" She wasn't asking for herself. She was asking for Birch, for the guard with the daughter who needed medicine, for all the people whose names she'd learned, whose burdens she'd carried. "Will you let them go?" The Alpha King studied her. His wolf-gold eyes moved across her face, and for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something crack in him. Some recognition, some memory of what they'd been to each other before Calla, before everything got twisted. Then he looked away. He didn't answer. He simply turned his head and looked away, as if the question wasn't worth his voice. That silence was worse than any blow. Rowena felt it move through her like a blade. Not anger, not despair. Something colder than both. Something final. She'd been waiting for him to choose her. To choose the truth. To choose what he knew in his bones was right. And in that silence she realized he never would. He'd already chosen. He'd chosen a long time ago. "I don't confess to what I didn't do," she said. Her voice was steady now. "And I won't pretend to be guilty so you can sleep better." She looked directly at the Alpha King then, made sure he saw her, made sure he understood what she was about to say. "I loved you," she said. "I loved you when you were isolated. I loved you when you were lost. I stood beside you because I believed you were better than this. I believed the bond between us meant something, that it meant you'd see the truth eventually, that you'd choose what was real over what was comfortable. A long beat, the great hall was utterly silent. But I don't anymore, Rowena continued. I don't love a man who keeps choosing another woman over the truth. I don't love a man who's too afraid to listen to what his own instincts are screaming at him. And I won't waste another moment waiting for you to become someone worth loving. The elders shifted in their seats. Some of them exchanged looks. The older ones, the ones who'd been at Blackthorn longest, they understood what she'd just done. She'd cut the bond. Publicly. Completely. She'd walked away from the Maypole itself and in a castle full of wolves that was the most dangerous thing a woman could do. But she meant every word. Birch was released that night. Not because the Alpha King suddenly believed in his innocence, but because something had shifted, because an elder had questioned the charges, because the people of Blackthorn had begun to whisper, because Rowena's silence had been replaced by clarity, and clarity was a weapon Calla couldn't burn. Rowena didn't return to her chamber. She went to the kitchens instead, where the cooks knew her, where the servants brought her news, and she began to understand what she'd become. Not a woman waiting for a man to save her. Not a woman hoping for love from someone incapable of it. Something else entirely. The night of the Blood Moon Feast arrived like a storm everyone could smell coming. Outside the castle walls, the border packs had gathered hungry, restless, their growls carrying across the stone ramparts. Inside the great hall, Calla sat at the head table in her stolen crown, her smile brittle as old bone. Theron stood to her left, and for the first time in weeks, Rowena saw something shift in his face. Not quite doubt, not yet, but a crack in the certainty he'd been wearing like armor. The elders came first, gray-furred, weathered men who'd served the kingdom through 3 alphas before Calla. They moved through the feast with the careful precision of those counting portions. One of them, broad-shouldered with silver threading his beard, leaned close to Calla. His voice was low-measured. "The grain reserves, Your Majesty. We need to discuss the redistribution for winter. The border packs are thin. The villages are reporting." He stopped, waited. The kind of pause that means you're giving someone a chance to answer. Calla's fingers tightened on her goblet. "The kitchens manage such details." "The kitchens report to you," the elder said, still calm, still patient. But there was something else underneath it now. A question she couldn't dodge. Another elder spoke up. This one had a scar that split his left eyebrow. "We need the exact count. How many stores remain, what's allocated for the winter months, what's committed to the border settlements." He looked at the others. "Surely the Alpha King knows these figures." A long moment stretched across the great hall. Servants froze mid-step. Guards standing at the walls went still. Even the hungry sound of the border packs outside seemed to fade. Calla's jaw worked. She opened her mouth, closed it. Then she turned to Theron. "Tell them. You've seen the accounting." Theron's throat tightened. He hadn't seen anything. They both knew it. But he was already reaching for the lie, already opening his mouth to blame the kitchens, to say the head cook had been negligent, that records were incomplete. That's when the hidden door behind the throne scraped open. It was the service entrance, the one used by servants to move unseen through the great hall. But Rowena didn't use it like a servant. She walked through it like someone who'd stopped asking permission. Behind her they came. The head cook, Flower, still dusting her sleeves. 3 guards Rowena had helped after Calla's cruelty had left them broken. Stable hands who'd been near starvation. A scribe from the storage houses. The woman who managed the grain accounts. One by one they filed into the great hall, and the room held its breath. Rowena carried the ledgers, not a copy. The originals. Leather-bound, meticulous, kept safe in places Calla had never thought to look because Calla had never thought to care. The witnesses stood in a line behind her, and she could feel the kind of feeling that ran through bone and blood, that every eye in the great hall had found her instead. She moved toward the center of the room, not toward the throne, toward the empty space where truth lived when it finally decided to show itself. "The grain reserves," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Are documented here. Every measure, every allocation, every storage house in Blackthorn, every village settlement, every commitment to the border packs." She opened the first ledger. For 3 months, these accounts have been kept by people who actually know how to read a supply line. People who understand that a kingdom survives on math, not promises. The head cook stepped forward. She came to the kitchens asking what we needed, not demanding, asking. Then she made sure we had it. One of the guards spoke up. His voice was rough. He'd lost teeth to Cala's rage once. She organized the stores so nothing would spoil. Found the grain that was going bad, redirected it to the border settlements before it was wasted. That's thousands of measures saved. The stable hand, thin-shouldered, but standing straight now, said, "She taught the grain accountant how to track rotation, how to keep records that matter. She didn't do it for herself. She did it so the kingdom would know what it actually had." Theron moved. He stepped forward, and for a moment Rowena thought he might reach for the ledgers, might try to take them back, might try to turn this around. But he stopped. He was staring at the numbers, at the dates, at the careful, methodical proof that while Cala wore the crown, while he'd been caught between the woman he'd chosen and the woman he'd betrayed, Rowena had been saving the entire kingdom from collapse. The scarred elder took the ledger from Rowena's hands. He studied it. Then he looked at Cala, and something in his face had gone cold as stone. "The accounts are in order. The stores are secure. The border settlements have been supported. All of this—" He gestured at the ledger, at the witnesses, at the Great Hall itself. None of this was done by the Alpha King. Cala stood. The crown sat crooked on her head. "She's a servant, a betrayer. She's stolen information that belongs to—" "To whom?" Rowena's voice cut through the Great Hall like winter. "To a crown that doesn't know how many days of food are left, to an Alpha who can't answer a simple question about her own kingdom." She looked at Theron, really looked at him. "He understands now. I can see it in his face. Finally." Theron's shoulders had curved inward. His hands hung at his sides. He was looking at the ledgers the way someone looks at a mirror after years of keeping their eyes closed. The scale of what Rowena had done alone without acknowledgement while he slept next to Cala was finally becoming real to him. Not the fact of it. He'd always known somehow. But the weight of it. The years she'd carried the kingdom while he carried nothing but confusion. Cala tried to speak again, tried to claim authority, but the elders had already turned their backs. The witnesses stood steady. The servants in the shadows of the Great Hall, the ones who'd always known but could never say their silence, had become a different kind of answer. Not obedience, not fear. Something closer to witness. One of the younger guards stepped to the edge of the hall and howled. Not a threat, a call. Outside the border, Pax responded. Not with hunger anymore, with recognition. The Alpha King's kingdom had been fed. The accounts were true. The winter could be met. Rowena held the ledgers against her chest and didn't look back at the throne. She'd spent months waiting for Theron to choose her, to see her, to understand what she'd been building in the spaces where no one was watching. She didn't need him to choose her now. The kingdom had already chosen. The people had already spoken. The bond between them that pulled that wordless knowing, it was still there. She could feel it like a scar that never quite healed, but it wasn't pulling her toward him anymore. It was pulling her away. Toward the work that still needed doing, toward the people who'd finally learned to trust her, toward the future that didn't require his permission to exist. The Alpha King stood at his throne, watching the woman he'd broken become the power he'd never understood. And for the first time he saw clearly what he'd lost. The Great Hall fell silent when the council elders moved forward with the crown. Not the crown Cala had worn, that one lay shattered on the stone floor, its jewels scattered like teeth. This was the original, older and heavier, the one that had belonged to the pack for generations. Rowena stood motionless as they approached, her hands at her sides. Cala was on her knees. She'd been there for a long moment, her body folded in on itself, her fingers clawing at the cold stone. When she looked up at Rowena, her face was a map of everything she'd lost. Not the crown, not the title. She'd lost the only thing that had ever mattered. The Alpha King's indifference had finally turned to disgust. He couldn't even look at her. "Mercy," Cala whispered, her voice cracked. "I was trying to hold it together for him, for us. I didn't know how else to—" "I'm not your judge," Rowena said. Her voice was steady but not unkind. "The council will decide." She turned away. Not in cruelty, in necessity. She could feel the weight of every servant Cala had struck, every worker she'd humiliated, every cook she'd starved for a perceived slight. That weight belonged to the council now, not to her. Theron stepped forward. He moved like a man walking through water, each step deliberate and heavy. When he reached the center of the hall, he lowered himself to one knee, then both. His head bowed. "I was a coward," he said. The words came out raw, unpolished. "I took what you gave me, your loyalty, your sacrifice, your love, And I called it weakness in you. I called it ambition when it was survival. I watched you build this kingdom from nothing, while I sat on a throne and told myself I'd earned it." Rowena said nothing. She was looking past him at the stone wall behind. "I remember now." His voice broke slightly. "All of it. Every time you stopped bleeding in the corridors so no one would see weakness. Every night you went without food so the guards would have enough. Every choice you made that cost you something. And I repaid you with a crown that was never yours to wear." He lifted his head. "I'm asking you to come back. As my Luna. As my mate. As the only person I've ever known who loved me more than she loved herself." The silence stretched. A long moment. Then another. "No," Rowena said. She turned to face him fully. "You lost me before the coronation ever happened. You lost me the first time you chose comfort over truth. The first time you let someone else wear a crown that belonged to the pack, not to a single person's vanity. You lost me every day you didn't look hard enough to see who was holding everything together." She paused. "That person wasn't you. It was never you." Theron remained on his knees. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. The council elders approached Rowena. The eldest, a woman with silver threading through her dark hair, held out the crown. It caught the light from the high windows, not ostentatious, just solid and true. "The pack offers you this," the woman said, "not as reward, as duty." Rowena took it. The metal was warm, as if it had been waiting for her hands all along. She didn't lift it to her head. She held it in front of her steady. "I accept," she said, "for the kingdom, for the people who trusted me when no one else did." She crowned herself. No ceremony, no flourish, just the simple act of a woman who'd learned that power wasn't something given by a man. It was something earned through every small choice to serve instead of to take. Theron watched from below as she became what he'd never had the strength to protect. The Alpha King had lost his throne, his mate, and the only person who'd ever loved him enough to save his kingdom from burning. She stood above him now, not in triumph, but in the quiet certainty of someone who'd finally stopped waiting to be chosen. Some losses you don't recover from. Some betrayals leave marks that no crown can heal.